Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our annual HERstory Family Day celebration. My name is Karen Sutton, Community Engagement Manager here at Levine Museum of the New South. Today, we are highlighting the historical strides that women took and continue to take to this day for voting rights. Suffrage, meaning the right to vote in elections, is a hallmark of modern political systems, but most countries limited voting to small groups. Voting rights only expanded slowly over time. This is especially true for women who usually had to fight hard for the right to vote. Women's right to vote was established nationally in 1920 after a long battle by suffragettes as the members of activist women's organizations in the early 20th century were known. Under the banner Votes for Women, they fought for the right to vote in public elections and created savvy and successful campaigns.
5, 6, 7, 8. D-E-L-T-A-S-I-G-M-A-T-H-E-T-A Delta Sigma Theta.
Native American women particularly influenced early women's suffrage activists in the United States. The Iroquois nations, which had an egalitarian society, were visited by early feminists and suffragettes. Those who visited discussed extensively how Native American women had authority in their own cultures at various conventions and in the news. Native American women became a symbol for some suffrage activists. However, other white suffragists actively excluded Native American people from the movement. When women gained the right to vote in 1920, suffragist Zikala Sa commented that Native Americans still had more work to do in order to vote. It was not until 1924 that many Native Americans could vote under the Indian Citizenship Act. In many states, there were additional barriers to Native American voting rights, and universal suffrage was not guaranteed in practice until the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, some protections of the Voting Rights Act have slowly been taken away since 2013.
Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution, beyond the power of any state to deny. The preamble of the federal Constitution says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." It is we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, nor yet we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed the Union. And we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot. For any state to make sex a qualification that must ever result in the disenfranchisement of one entire half of the people is to pass a bill of attainder or an ex facto law, and is therefore a violation of the supreme law of the land. By it, the blessings of liberty are forever withheld from women and their female prosperity. To them, This government has no just powers derived from the consent of the governed. To them, this government is not a democracy. It is not a republic. It is an odious aristocracy, a hateful oligarchy of sex, the most hateful aristocracy ever established on the face of the globe, an oligarchy of wealth where the rich govern the poor, an oligarchy of learning where the educated govern the ignorant, or even an oligarchy of race where the Saxon rules the African, might be endured. But this oligarchy of sex, which makes father, brothers, husbands, sons, the oligarchs over the mother and sisters, the wife and daughters of every household, which ordains all men sovereign, all women subjects, carries dissension, discord, and rebellion into every home of the Union. Webster, Worcester, and Bouvier all define a citizen to be a person of the United States, entitled to vote and hold office. The only question left to be settled now is, are women persons? And I hardly believe any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say they are not. Being persons, then, women are citizens. And no state has a right to make any law or to enforce any old law that shall abridge their privileges or immunities. Hence, every discrimination against women in the constitutions and laws of the several states is today null and void, precisely as is every one against Negroes.
Suffragettes pioneered many innovative political tactics still used today. These include lobbying elected officials, going door to door to convince male voters in New York State to vote yes on the statewide suffrage ballot initiative, and picketing the White House. Suffragists also leveraged the burgeoning consumer culture by creating political literature such as flyers, badges, and cartoons, and infused their public protests with symbolism and visual impact by proudly wearing white at a time when it was unusual for women to even gather in public. One of those tactics was the woman suffrage procession in 1913, the first suffragist parade in Washington, D.C. It was also the first large organized march in Washington for political purposes. The procession was organized by the suffragists Alice Paul and Lucy Burns for the National American Woman Suffrage Association, an organization which later transitioned into what is today known as the League of Women Voters, whose members continue to advocate for voting rights. However, the 1913 procession was not perfect in all aspects. Black members of the state delegations were told to march in the back in a segregated fashion. Among the procession were the 22 young founders of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated at Howard University, who were told to march in the rear of the parade and were not listed in the official program. Some reported that Deltas broke from their segregated section to mix with the rest of the parade. In 2013, a Centennial anniversary march was held in Washington, D.C., and the group chosen to lead the parade this time were members of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, of which we are proud members.
5, 6, 7, 8.
109 years ago, 22 women had to go on a mission to make the world a little greater. And in 1913, founded Delta Sigma Theta. Public service and sisterhood are for what our founders stood. It carries on until today because Delta Sigma Theta is the only way.
She most certainly suffered unjust rejection galore. I don't know her at all. She seems really fascinating and I'd like to know more.
Who was the face behind Chinese Girl Wants Vote? From the National Park Service. Dr. Mabel Pinghua Li was born in China and lived from 1896 to 1966. After immigrating to the United States, when she was just 16 years old, Mabel Li was a known figure in New York's suffrage movement. When New York City suffragists held a parade in 1912 to advocate for women's voting rights, Mabel Li on horseback helped lead the parade from its start. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women throughout the U.S. the right to vote, but Chinese women like Mabel Li could not vote until 1943. This was because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a federal law that was in place before she was born. The Chinese Exclusion Act limited Chinese immigration and prevented them from becoming citizens. Here are some of Mabel's words from her writings, China's Submerged Half, and the meaning of women's suffrage.
I plead for a wider sphere of usefulness for the long-submerged women of China. I ask for our girls to open the door to the treasury of knowledge, the same opportunities for physical development as boys, and the same rights of participation in all human activities of which they are individually capable.
The neglect and indifference to a woman's welfare in the past must be remedied. Prejudice must be removed and a healthy public sentiment created to support the progressive movement.
It's a fact that no matter where we go, we cannot escape hearing about women's suffrage. The idea of women's suffrage at first stood for something abnormal, strange, and extraordinary, and so has finally become the word for anything ridiculous. The idea that women should ever wish to have or be anything more than their primitive mothers appears at first thought to be indeed tragic enough to be comic. But if we sit down and really think it over, throwing aside all sentimentalism, we find that it is nothing more than a wider application of our ideas of justice and equality.
We all believe in the idea of democracy. Women's suffrage is the application of democracy to women.
After graduating from Barnard College, Mabel Li got a PhD in economics at Columbia University. She was the first Chinese woman to do so. After her father died in 1924, she took over his role as director of the First Chinese Baptist Church of New York City. She later founded a Chinese community center offering vocational and English classes, a health clinic, and a kindergarten.
The fundamental principle of democracy is equality of opportunity. I cannot too strongly impress the importance of suffrage for the requirement of women to be worthy citizens and contribute their share to the steady progress of our country towards prosperity and national greatness.